Slavery was an eminent part of the medieval ages, but the most brutal of them was obviously that of the Viking Age. Sexual harassment, human sacrifices, and cruel punishments were part of the Norse society. Let us dig through the buried history from the sagas and law texts found in archaeological studies to know the diabolical history of thralls in the Viking Age. The English language still has traces of Scandinavian enslavement. The phrase "to be kept in thrall," which refers to being under someone else's control, comes from the Old Norse word for a slave, thrall. Scandinavian countries include Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland. It is evident from historical chronicles that the Vikings enslaved or sold thousands of men, women, and children as slaves or thralls, as they were known in Old Norse, as they ravaged coastal communities from the British Isles to the Iberian Peninsula. Slaves may have made up as much as 10% of Scandinavia's population during the Viking Age, according to one estimate. From where did so many thralls come from? One of the most significant goods traded by the Vikings was slaves or thralls. Their trips to Eastern Europe and the British Isles were where they mostly bought slaves. Moreover, slavery was a common punishment for crimes like murder and theft, and was another source of slaves for the Vikings. Slave trade was also conducted before the Viking Age, but due to their huge commercial networks and vast conquests of new lands, enslavement became a trade and brought immense money for the Vikings. The active purchase of human property became a significant component of the Viking economy. One of the main goals of their military operations and raids was to accomplish this. In Scandinavia, there was a sharp rise in the population of slaves. In Scandinavia during the Viking Age, around 1 in every 5 residents were slaves. These slaves were assigned to certain occupations, the most difficult and demeaning ones in society. The Norse thraldom. While the majority of the slaves under the Norse thraldom system had limited freedom, it wasn't usually pure chattel slavery. The slave could not inherit anything and could not leave anything behind. Of course, they received no compensation, although in certain cases they were permitted to keep a tiny amount of the money they made by selling the products for their owners at the market. As a result, it was theoretically feasible for a slave to buy their freedom, though this was uncommon. Every Viking invasion was motivated by the horrible anguish that was inflicted upon everyone at the time of enslavement, the surreal feeling of being transformed in an instant from a free man to a slave, just like a piece of property. The lowest rung of the Scandinavian social ladder was occupied by thralls. They were northwestern and eastern Europeans who were made into slaves as a result of being captured during the battle, accruing debt, or being inherited into the class by their parents. The master a thrall served determined their living circumstances in Scandinavia. Harsh lives of thralls. Slaves handled a large portion of the work around the hamlet, while the warriors spent the majority of their time fighting or drinking. To a Viking, being told that he needed to milk his cows was a grave affront. With so many available, no freeborn Norseman needed to milk any cows, as that was viewed as work for slaves and women. Slaves frequently led rather gruesome lives. Regular acts of violence against slaves were carried out for both religious and disciplinary purposes. Slaves were frequently killed after their owner passed away so they could continue serving them after they passed. While this was going on, slave women would have been assigned tasks like milking cows, grinding grain at the quern, sitting at the fire and cooking food, and perhaps watching after the kids. One of the Old Norse Edict poems, the List of R.G., lists the duties carried out by the oppressed. Kindling and plating supplies for weaving baskets were transported on the backs of these thralls. Meanwhile, his family repaired fences, plowed the fields, cared for the pig barn, kept an eye on the goats, and dug peat. Their physical appearance reflected the arduous hard labor. They had sunburned, wrinkly skin, gnarled hands, scabbed nails, and dreary eyes. Their bare feet were smeared in dirt from the hard work they had to put in plowing the fields. Burial of thralls along with their masters. The Viking chief's cremation ceremony was unusual. After a chief passed away, one of his slave girls was forced to go with him to the afterlife. She She had to go through a painful ceremony first, though. The slave girl was repeatedly given booze to get her high while the cremation ritual was being prepared. She was then made to partake in sexual rites and have sex with every man in the tribe before being strangled. Her body was subsequently thrown on a wooden ship beside the Viking chiefs after she had been strangled by the local elders. The ship was then set on fire and launched into the water. This guaranteed that she would serve her master for all of eternity in the hereafter. The Vikings used this technique to alter their chieftain's life energy. This appears to be one of the Vikings' strangest, most horrifying ceremonies. Since these Vikings were so cruel, they murdered helpless slaves so that they could be buried with their owners or just to appease their gods. One of the suffering classes in Viking society was the slave. Mass sacrifice of thralls at religious festivals. Swedish kings offered human sacrifices at the Uppsala temple every 9 years. 9 heads would be offered as sacrifices to the gods while the bodies were hanged in the sacred grove of the temple. It lasted for 9 days and involved 81 sacrifices, feasts, and Yule festivities. This tradition was carried out to express gratitude to Odin and to assure success in the upcoming year. In the past, humans would slaughter a large number of animals to satisfy the gods. When it didn't work, they sacrificed a group of slaves or convicts at the Uppsala temple. Viking sex slaves. The female thralls of the Vikings were treated like sex slaves. They would lead a dead slave there for the dogs and birds to eat. Female slaves served as household helpers, cooks, and concubines. Male thralls most likely helped their Viking rulers build ships, chop wood, and row those ships. Following their religious beliefs, the Vikings offered infant slave girls as sacrifices to their pagan gods. There was a greater risk of adultery because the Vikings were frequently absent from their homes. Gender roles were shifted as a result of the Vikings' mass killing of infant females. For a newborn to be treated as a person, a few rites were carried out at the time of birth. Before this, the child was not seen as a human being, perhaps as a way for adults to emotionally shield themselves. When the kid was born, his master picked him up and tucked him under his coat before leaving him on the ground. In doing so, the master demonstrated his acceptance of the infant as his child. If the child had any problems, they would leave him to die. Skeletal remains of alleged slaves from the Viking era were discovered in graves in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. These bones revealed evidence of mistreatment and beheading. Iron collars and shackles were discovered at several locations that were likely Viking slave trafficking centers. This was the diabolical history of thralls in the Viking Age. Thanks for watching the video. If you liked the video, check out other historical videos on our channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so that you don't miss out on such interesting topics.